Let's continue indexing basics here. And in this video, what we're going to be discussing is filtering before we move over to the right side of the screen, looking at Microsoft's more detailed example. And the reason why I want to discuss filtering is because this is a situation that does apply in certain cases. A good example of this is a lot of, let's say, market data with the Hang Seng, where we realize that, let's say, 90 to 95% of our queries are queries on the last year, the last 2 years, or the last 5 years, right? So there's a time range limitation. Now, in some environments, one of the things that we do is we'll just go ahead and archive the data, and there are many good reasons for archiving data, right? Now, one of those is it no longer interferes. But consider the fact that there's definitely maintenance overhead that comes with indexing. Not only we're talking about rebuilding the index, but it does store data, right? So let's look at this block example. And we remember that in this block example, the S is looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? It stores that to where people can hit the S and get to where they need, right? So the S is kind of like our index here in our example. Suppose that we found that 99% of our queries looked for blocks 5 and above. Okay, and we could even say, let's suppose our example, there were much more blocks in this. This is just the first 6. There were many more blocks, but 99% of them were looking for 5 and above. Well, one of the things that we could do, depending on, of course, the environment, is we could actually filter out the 1, 2, 3, and 4. We could actually create an index that looks at that value where it is 5 and above. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at this example in SQL Server. And the reason for this is it's a very useful tool in certain situations. Market situations are a great example of this. But there are other situations. eBay would be another good example of where you may only, for instance, maybe 90% of transactions on eBay occur within a year of when they were posted. Since it's a bidding system. So if we go ahead and look at this, what we're doing here is we're creating a non-clustered index twice, same index name and everything. But the difference is in the second time, as you see, what we've done is we're filtering on the savings rate where it's greater than or equal to 5. So when we execute these queries, and what we're doing is we're looking in this query as where the savings rate is greater than 5, we're going to be hitting that filter. And let's suppose, again, that most of the queries were looking at where the savings rate was 5 or greater. Maybe somebody's looking at where it's greater than 10%. Maybe they're looking at it whether it's greater than 15%, right? The idea is what we want to do in this example is if the majority of our queries were looking at 5 and above, then we could create a clustered index. By the way, I happen to know a lot of Americans don't save 5% or more of their income, so this would actually be a pretty decent filter depending on what the queries behind the scenes are. But it would filter out, it would skip, if you would, the records on the assumption that we don't want to look at. Okay, let's scroll this up here. And what we're doing is we're paying attention to 2 and 4. For those of you who are math people, let's see here. And we can see that the cost relative to the batch is 5% versus 4%. Now, luckily, this table is not a table that carries a lot of records in the sense that it's a pretty small table overall. But the idea is that, going back to this is an example of where in our data set, we can actually apply a further filter. And a good example of this as well is looking at a column that's not null, right? Because as many of you know, some of our tables have null columns, but that there's actually a cost associated with that. I'll give you kind of another example of where I think indexing is very useful. I came across a situation one time where there was loan data, and we would decide to put a query on the loan balance, and the reason is because a lot of the queries involved the loan balance. However, I noticed that there were loan balances that had negative, and I thought most of their queries were like doesn't equals 0, and I was like, okay, so when you're querying something and it doesn't equal 0, what are you trying to accomplish there? Like, what do you need to know when a balance is negative? And they're like, oh, we don't care about that. We want to know when there's a positive balance. In other words, there's money owed, right? And I was like, okay, so let's filter out everything that doesn't equal, that's not 0 and doesn't equal a negative balance. So basically, the bank doesn't owe the person, right? Because the idea is that all of the queries we're looking at is where a balance is owed. We never look at where a balance is not owed. So let's go ahead and apply that filter and get rid of those records, right? And that saved a huge amount of cost. But then when you have to think about the reindexing, it's not going to be as big of an index. It's going to be a fraction of that index. So consider that as well when we're talking about these indexing basics. We're not just talking about indexing an entire column. We could filter that further if we decide that that's something that would be more useful for us.